So welcome again to the Conversation Cafe today. Today's topic is promoting diversity. And as we do that, I want to acknowledge that one of the greatest ways of we show diversity is through our different cultures and our racial backgrounds. And I do want to acknowledge that Concordia University, and where I am as well, is on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka land. And the city where Concordia is Churchage, Montreal. And so the indigenous peoples, the Kanien'kehá:ka, have for millions of years gathered there, learned there, built community there, and shared their wisdom. And so we want to acknowledge that and are thankful for the continued relationship. And if you're not in Montreal, Churchage, I just invite you to think for a moment about where you are and who the first peoples are of the land. Because it's all, remembering the relationship and building relationships with the first peoples of our places is actually one of the founding pieces of diversity. And that's what we're here to discuss. So I'm thrilled to welcome Chad Walcott. Chad is our guest today. You get to introduce yourself in a minute, a bit more, but Chad is actually a Concordia grad, and I'm always thrilled to know what grads are up to and what amazing things they do. And so I try and see them on Facebook, and I've sort of, I'm not lurking, but when something pops up, I'm always interested in knowing what you do. And I just have to pass my phone off. Thank you. And so a few weeks ago, a post popped up that Chad was welcomed into the group of 30, Groupe des 30, of people who promote diversity and are actually working for diversity in Montreal. And that really interested me because I thought, wow, we so often talk about it, but here's someone who's doing something. So that's what we're here. That's our starting point. So Chad, so this conversation is, I'll ask a few questions. Chad will tell his story, but please, if you have questions, raise your hand, or if there's a lull in the conversation, you can ask. Please try and ask a question and not just sort of go on about your own perspective. We're here to learn from Chad in particular, though of course we want to hear yours as well. And if you don't want to ask, you can also type them in the chat, and we will bring him into the conversation. So Chad, what have you been up to since you left Concordia?
A number of things, actually. I dabbled in insurance for a while. I didn't really like that, so I decided to go work a bit more in community engagement through raising funds for the Jewish General Hospital for cancer and Alzheimer's. After that, I went to dabble a bit in marketing and community work, where I worked in for a small marketing firm, but then we launched actually a nonprofit nonprofit organization to launch a revitalization project in the Chabanel district of Hanse-Kertzeville. So for those of you who aren't familiar with that district, it used to be the Montreal's manufacturing sector until the 90s, and globalization kind of made our manufacturing market go overseas. So that kind of area went into a bit disrepair and was kind of forgotten. So we were working on an initiative to kind of bring people back, try to give it back the old prestige that it had. And it was a fairly successful event, something that the borough ended up taking over even after our nonprofit went to the wayside and I moved on to other things, which is actually when I met Joanna and continued learning a bit about marketing. She took me on with a team called a company called Mape, which is like an international construction company or construction material company. But so that ended up kind of giving me an opportunity to dive a bit deeper into marketing, into campaigns, and after which time I joined the city of Montreal. So now I work for the city of Montreal for the mayor of Côte-des-Neiges and DG, advising on social development, economic development, and kind of being a first point of contact for residents. So it's been quite an interesting, all that in a nutshell. There's other stuff in between, I guess, but les grandes lignes kind of are about that. And now recently I was accepted to the G30 program, so le Groupe des 30, which has the mandate to promote diversity. So through that, I'm hoping to develop some workshops for youth to give them a bit of an understanding of the different ways to succeed and to get into positions of leadership in different structures.
Wow. And what interested you, or how did you get into the sort of diversity? Diversity is such a, I don't want to say it's a buzzword, but it is in a way. And so often we use it, and I don't know, I think we know what we mean by it, but what does it mean to you, and how did you get involved? And maybe more importantly, what excites you about it?
Yeah, I guess when I got involved in diversity, I almost would say that I was kind of, as a person of color, entering or going through life, I'm kind of always involved in working in diversity, right?
Right.
I think I really started in that while I was at Concordia. I think it was really a good place for me to learn more concretely about the concepts of diversity, and not just like ethnocultural diversity, but you know, gender diversity, neurological diversity, like in all those aspects. Really, Concordia was a great place for me to be exposed to that, and I had the privilege of working with other leaders within the Concordia community to really explore those concepts and try to work actively towards creating safe spaces wherever I kind of worked. So I think I started really doing that at Concordia, and then throughout I've worked on various more or less informal mentorship programs with youth from diverse backgrounds, and trying to kind of help them, like I said, enter either politics or nonprofits, or just give them the tools really that they need to succeed, tools that I wasn't necessarily exposed to right off the bat through my own path, but that I discovered along the way. And so I want to try to give back and send the ladder back down, if you will. I've managed through my career to kind of establish myself in a way, and I feel like it's time to send the ladder back down and allow others to kind of not go through the same mistakes or miss the same opportunities I did getting to this point, because there were many, and unfortunately, not everyone's exposed to the same opportunities. Not everyone's presented with the kind of vast gamut of options out there, and I want to be able to help spread that information more to youth, of all youth.
One would argue that the world has changed some. We still have a long way to go, but I think in the time when you were at Concordia now, I think maybe we're more aware of diversity or working more active. I'm hopeful anyway. What was you talk about tools? What are some of those tools you'd like to pass on to people, to young people in particular?
Right. So when I was kind of growing up or kind of going through the education system or whatever, I was always kind of, the educational system kind of, unless you have external inputs or people who have done the extracurriculars or the side programs or whatever, they're not necessarily presented to you, right? So opportunities that would have likely interested me when I was younger and would have helped me maybe choose a different path or choose the same path sooner were just invisible to me. So in that regard, I want to try to help young people, especially young people in vulnerable communities, help them find those opportunities, help them know those opportunities exist, whether they be scholarships, whether they be excellence programs that they might not otherwise be aware of, or just model UNs. I didn't know about anything model UN until I got to university, and all these people I'm involved in CSU and ASFOR, they're like, I did this, I went to this specialized school, and I'm like, wow, okay, so these programs exist, but I think I want to help people become aware of them. And then outside of that, I want to, and I think this is something I've been working on for since my time at Concordia and before, is just making sure people have a good understanding of the civics around them. I think there's a big gap in terms of civic education, and a lot of people don't know either their own rights or how to advocate for them in an effective way. And I want to try to, while giving people kind of a menu of different options that are available to them academically and kind of extracurricularly, I want to also give them the tools to, if they ever are in a position of leadership, to be able to excel, to be able to understand the terrain and navigate it without necessarily hitting the same obstacles or just being able to be effective in general, I think.
Yeah. I'm keeping an eye on hands on open mics for questions. So because I always have a lot of questions, but I'm also aware that I'm not the only person in the room. So I'll just, if you have questions, please speak up.
Oh, no, I don't have a question. I think it's he's doing a wonderful job and that's the way to go. I sit on the Bath Shaw Family Services Diversity Committee for many years now. But I was wondering, does it really work, Chad, to show your face on these tables of diversity? Because I remember an incident where they were, many years ago when it was the Shafia case where this Afghani family had drowned, the women of the family had drowned, and things like that. And so the Batshaw Family Services were compiling a book on honor killing. And I told, and when they spoke about it at the table or meeting table, I said, no, this is not the right way to do it. There is no honor in killing. You don't have to put that word. Just put femicide because it's a murder of women. But they were arguing and arguing. No, it's honor killing and all that. So I'm wondering now. You're giving your perspective. You're giving your knowledge. You're giving your experience. Is it really working? Are they really listening? Who's listening? And they went ahead and they put the word honor killing in their book.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's unfortunate because I don't think the honor killings happen the other way around, right? I think you're right in naming it as femicide, and there is unfortunately a phobia associated to it, right? We continue with the othering, we continue with the idea that like this only belongs to that community. But we see now in the news that it's clearly everywhere, right? The issues of domestic abuse, issues of femicide, it's present in all communities. But to really assign it to that one community is to be disingenuous a little bit, I think.
But do they listen to you when you make suggestions and to make changes?
I don't. Okay, and so to come back to the original question of do tables work, I think they can, but they need to be followed with action. So I kind of adopt a different strategy. Yes, I attend the tables. Yes, I give my opinion. But if I think something needs to be done, and I just do it. So in your situation, I don't know that you could have done anything different to influence them in that way. I think they should have taken more time to hear your point of view. And I don't know the composition of this board, but I would assume that it probably wasn't particularly diverse despite the name of the committee, which is usually the case. But I think that in general, when committees come together, when these tables come together, the discussion is only secondary to the outcome. So if there is discussion and no outcome, then it's not effective. But if there is discussion and work in a certain direction, then you can say that the table is effective. So an example that is happening now, like something I'm currently working on, is there's a group of Black business owners in NDG who are looking to see about improving their situation. So we're a committee, we're a table that kind of informally, or I recently joined, and I guess they already existed, looking at how do we help these business owners specifically, right? Because there are different paths to take, business associations, this and that, but we're talking about a subset of a business group of small business owners who have particular needs. And so out of that, so we have different, we debate the theories, we debate the context, but out of that, I'm trying to make concrete moves. I'm trying to give them examples and strategies that they can take to advance their rights and their advocacy, right? Because at the end of the day, they need to formally get together and form an advocacy group and make certain demands in order for the system to kind of move in that direction. You know, government and institutions are big machines that take a long time to do, but you need to put inputs in a particular way to get results. And so I try to help people figure out what the proper inputs are so that they can have a result, because talking just to talk doesn't go anywhere.
Stefan has his hand up.
Go ahead, Stefan. Or Fox, right? If I'm
yes, it has been some time.
Oh, wow.
Yes, we dueled with swords quite some time ago. It was very exciting.
I almost got Stefan killed by a bunch of 7-year-olds.
Those were good times.
Nice.
Yes, styrofoam is stronger than you think. So the question I had was regarding framing, because in situations like femicide versus honor killing, it's all about the questions that are asked, and there's ways to ask those questions to frame it so that the outcome becomes, oh, it must be honor killings, it can't be femicide because it's coming from what we want to lead to. So how have you been able to resist those kinds of narratives in the past? Have you been able to sort of challenge these attempts at framing when they've come up in discussions that you've had about diversity with groups that may or may not be interested in hearing divergent points of view?
In certain cases, I like to, when we're talking more of like a table or like a strategic committee or something, I like to bring in like someone who would know more about that, right? So the recent kind of, so I'm recently founded a diversity committee within the Green Party of Canada. And so it's like a large committee that's going to have different subcommittees, ethnocultural, LGBTQ, people with disabilities. So specifically on the people with disabilities subcommittee, the question was, how do we call it, right? What is the terminology that this community prefers? So right now we're still waiting to hear back from the recommendations, but basically our conclusion and what I pushed the rest of the committee towards was, look, let's ask the community how they would like to be referred to, and then form the name of that subcommittee from that discussion. So essentially, I tried to make sure, if it was a question of honor killings versus femicide, I would bring in someone from the community. I'd bring in Shaheen, and I would listen to what she had to say and go in that direction. But institutions and governments, whether they be city, provincial, federal, whatever, they are less willing to, right? So the question now of systemic racism, that is like the battle I'm waging as directly as I can, because I'm not involved in the provincial government at the moment. But I think it's essential. And I think that's a clear example of an institution that does not want to recognize systemic racism because they understand that if they name the problem, then they are tasked with dealing with it. And in politics, I can tell you that politicians do not like to own a problem, right? If it's something that has always existed or existed before them or existed after them, they will punt it until the next administration or until people decide to talk about something else, until the next crisis comes about. So that's the frustration there, is the need, especially it's something so big as systemic racism, to name it and to own the fact that you are the government at this time, and though you did not create this problem directly, you are in charge of dealing with it, and you are in charge of not making it worse, speaking to Bill 21. And so in that battle of perception, you have to be insistent. You have to name the problem. So if you want to call it systemic racism, if you want to call it institutional racism, you must name it. And those things are, in my mind, interchangeable. And maybe we could have the debate as to, institutional versus systemic, but you have to name it first in order to deal with it. And if you can't, then you're not starting from a place of wanting to deal with it, unfortunately. So in that regard, we need to, I guess, play to hearts and minds. But the question of how and the question of communicating, it depends. It depends who you're talking to. It depends where they are on the debate, and you need to adapt to your audience. And that's what marketing, that's what dabbling in marketing really helped me to, develop is that ability to communicate to different personas, if you are, different groups, in the way that they're going to receive it. And so there isn't a blanket one answer meets all. You really have to, while insisting on the terminology, you have to tune your message and your delivery so that it is received by the people that need to hear it.
Thank you very much for a thorough and understandable answer.
You're welcome.
I think you had some claps there too. That was really interesting. And I guess I have a follow-up question from way earlier. You talked about civics. If people understand civics and the process, Shaheen just clapped too. But my understanding is that a lot of the civics and processes have been designed by white settlers from a very white standpoint, and often with white ideas of white supremacy. So is that the answer? Like, are we not asking racialized people to just slot into a system that people who look like me created, or how do you approach that?
Okay, well, I mean, my time at Concordia taught me that change from the outside is possible, but it does take significant effort and sustained effort, right? And so the question is, do we want to ask racialized communities to have to take to the streets on a long-term basis in order to get the changes that they need now, right? I was just finished reading Martin Luther King's Chaos or Community. And so he's talking about the black rights movement, the civil rights movement, sorry, and how it took 10 years of active mobilization in order to get the most basic rights. And a lot of communities don't have that time. They need the resources that they need now. And so I like to try to use Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals in this instance and really show, like, yes, there needs to be pressure from the outside, but there also needs to be an understanding of how the system currently works. If people are able to navigate the system, if people have a better understanding of the structures in place, then they can also identify where the weak links are and where to put the pressure. So it's not simply, you know, in order to get what you want, you need to fill out form A, B, C, D. It's, you know, you want to start a petition, don't waste your time with change.org. That doesn't mean anything. Here are the proper procedures. Here is an MP that might be favorable to it. Once it gets there, these are the other follow-up things. So it's really a strategy of a holistic approach to how to advance your needs and how to advance your rights in an effective way. And that's something that I always believed in, but it's something I've really been able to fine tune over the last few years working for the municipal government. Sorry, I muted myself. You're working for the municipal government because I realized just to what point people are unaware of how civics works, of how the government, different levels of government work, how they work with each other, how they affect each individual person in their day-to-day life, just in the questions that I received. So I think that information could be widely just necessary and helpful for people to choose better representatives, to navigate the systems and get what they need done. But for vulnerable communities or racialized communities or minority communities writ large, I think giving them the roadmap to how to get things done and where to put pressure to affect change will help them. Maybe not more. You need diversity of tactics. You need both. You need the outside pressure that's consistent, but you also need people working on the inside and working through the system to identify problems and make change. Because if you just are rallying on the outside, then you still are not really at the decision-making table to implement the changes you need in the system, basically.
Well, that's really interesting. And I would argue too, like when you say time, we don't have time right now. People are literally dying. So, you know, every Black person who dies is we already lost too much time for that. So, so I really appreciate that perspective. I'm curious, what empowered you? Like, what were the shaping factors or people or influences in your life? I know that's a personal question and I didn't write that on a list, but I'm always curious, how did you learn that stuff?
I guess I come from a very fiery family of people who don't mind a little bit of conflict and are ready to speak our mind, you know. I'll tell you though, that it was never my plan. But my plan was go to Concordia, head down, go to class, get out with a degree, go to law school and be a lawyer and then, you know, be prime minister, right? So,
oh, yes. Okay.
Yeah, but once I got there, my plans changed pretty much immediately. I saw my friend Aaron's face on a poster. I wondered, if Aaron's on a poster, how do I get on a poster? And then that decision changed the rest of my life. Actually, it changed the course of everything, because at that point I was exposed to different people who helped shape me, helped open my eyes to advocacy work. It put me in a position to advocate, and it's something that I really enjoyed and something I really clung to, and I was bitten by the political bug at that point. And before that, I mean, a couple of my friends, good friends, Larissa and Mike, well, Larissa, and then Mike Nalco, who was my boss when I worked at camp. That's really when I saw the fact that I had the ability to affect the younger generations in a positive way and develop leaders. And so I think that combining those two experiences really is what driving me. You know, the idea that I have a responsibility now that I have achieved leadership position, I guess, in some regard, to form other leaders so that we can all be the change we want to see. You know, we can rail against the machine, we can complain, we can yell, we can cry about it, but if we don't take things into our own hands and start pushing forward for the change we want to see, then it won't happen. So yeah, I think the big formative years were when I worked the like 6 years I worked at camp, and then the time I spent at Concordia on the front lines of different issues really opened my eyes to the need to be loud and be present and be heard, I guess. Plus the fact that I am from a family who's loud and present and heard.
Wow. Wow. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, no problem.
Scanning, Shaheen gives you a thumbs up. I'm looking if there's other questions. Just want to give people time to formulate them. Okay. So I'd love to hear some more stories of either of success stories, or sometimes those successes come through what's first a failure or some obstacle you encountered. So I'm just wondering if you can sort of tell us a couple of stories about when something you're particularly either proud of or that you just feel has been a really good experience or a good learning or something.
Yeah, I mean, we touched on it a little bit before.
Yeah, we did.
I think one of the things I'm most proud of was the mobilization we were able to do around tuition increase back in 2011, 2012. I think honestly, that was one of the things that put me on the radar for different opportunities that I got afterwards. You know, I had a chance after that experience to go work for Projet Montreal as like their visibility and recruitment person. And so I think that was really one of my bigger accomplishments and something I'm very proud of. That and the pop-up village that we had launched in the Chabanel area, just because the speed at which that got accomplished was I've never seen something that fast. And I don't want to, you know, we had great help with the borough administration at the time, but to go from zero money and an idea to a fully fledged container village and over hundreds of $1,000s of funding in 6 months was something that I didn't think was possible, but we managed to do. In terms of obstacles, I'm good at getting around obstacles or roadblocks for the most part. So I guess I'm privileged in that sense that, you know, the barriers that I came up against, I was able to find a solution to. I think in terms of diversity or I guess, getting to that point, I think it comes back to what I was saying before about having missed opportunities or having been unaware of different structures that existed that may have made my path forward easier or just easier. Because I realized throughout this process that it's not only what you know, but who you know, right? You need to make those connections. You need to create that network. You need to bring in other people, because otherwise, you know, you're an unknown entity. You don't have the necessary connections to get where you need to go, or have that safety net in case you do fail or do hit an obstacle that you can get around it. So yeah, I don't know. I've been blessed to have good mentors, to have good, you know, people giving me opportunities when I needed them most. And so I can't say that I necessarily hit major obstacles to what I wanted to do, aside from maybe financial obstacles or, you know, credit obstacles.
But you're somebody that you don't let them stop you. You're just like, okay, obstacle, now how are we going to get around that? So
kind of, yeah. I'm like a bulldozer in that way. I'm like the obstacle, get around, go. So but yeah, if I can send down the ladder and help others overcome obstacles that they don't know are there, then that's what I want to do.
Could some people call it bulldozers? I might also call it resilience or persistence.
Yeah,
you know,
I guess I'm resilient.
Yeah. Okay, Shaheen, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, you were speaking about this container village. What was that? I don't know about it.
Okay, so what year was it? I guess 2017.
Okay.
Basically, I was working in this area on Louvain Street, which is in the Chabanel district of Ahuntsic-Cartierville.
Okay.
So the north of Montreal. So it's Montreal's former manufacturing district. And so manufacturing in the 90s left and went abroad. And so the district itself, which is mainly like factories and manufacturing, like it kind of died economically, if you will. Okay. And so while I was working for this firm, you know, we were across the street from this giant vacant lot. It was just this big gravel lot. There used to be a building there. They demolished it, and the city was looking to turn it into a working yard. So you know, the neighbors around the different office buildings and the people living there, they didn't really like the idea of having that be just another work yard, just having the noise of the buses and this and that going there. So we approached the borough with a concept to create a pop-up village. So to create kind of this little event venue that would be made up primarily, like the buildings inside would be modified shipping containers. And we would have artistic shows, like showcase Montreal artists, both like painting art, like all forms of art, basically, whether it be music, dance, whatever, as well as the small businesses in this space. So I went around and I approached all the small businesses and I said, hey, do you want to set up kind of a almost sidewalk sale event space in our little bunker, we called it. And so it ended up being a really interesting experience. I learned firsthand, like,
so it was like business oriented. I thought maybe when you said village, in my mind it came that maybe it's the housing for the homeless or something like that, you know.
No, in the area that we're in, there was not so many homeless people that I noticed anyways, and there was a residential neighborhood not too far away. But no, this particular initiative was more with the business community and the small business community, more so than on the community side of things.
All right. Okay, thank you.
Mark?
Oh, mine was a quick one. I'm just impressed because, I mean, the history of that area north of sort of Marché Central, and like there was the market, like the physical market itself, but it was a place of exchange. So I very much like this idea of returning to exchange, both with like small enterprises, but also like just keeping the area visible again. So.
Yeah, and that was the spirit of it. It was kind of like, let's bring it back to what it was, let's recreate.
Yeah.
And so we were able to run it for 1 year, and then unfortunately we ran into like problems of different visions and problems of finances or whatever. And I had already left to go work elsewhere with Joanna. So unfortunately our part of that project fell to the wayside, but the borough liked it so much and it was such a hit that they ended up finding someone else to do the same thing. So, and now that's kind of prolonged this discussion around the lot, and so they're trying to look at a hybrid option of, you know, part city owned, like work voirie is what they call it, and part park potentially. So so even though it started off as a more business oriented, it may have some community benefits in terms of like the creation of a park. Now there's a lot of work still to be done in decontaminating that site, but at least the conversation lives on.
Stefan says it became an institution too popular to dismiss out of hand. Nice.
Exactly. Yeah. So we kind of, again, see, this is another opportunity where we could have just talked about it endlessly with them and negotiated and talked about the concept and showed them things, but we kind of decided to, you know, go fast and break things, as Mark Zuckerberg says, and in the end, we were able to create something that outlasted us. So that's a dream.
Sometimes it's easier to where should I start? We sometimes get bogged down in the planning, and sometimes it's easy to think we need to know every detail before we start. And in some way there is some truth to it, but sometimes we get so bogged down that we don't ever start. And so I really like your approach of just let's get going and see where we go, and see what we figure out along the way, and then the answers will kind of come, or more questions. I guess it reminds me too of the saying, you know, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission.
Yeah, that was kind of our philosophy, because we definitely stepped on a few toes in getting started, but you know, the people who we started off offending ended up being our closest allies in the process. So, you know, sometimes you just got to go and you figure out the rest afterwards, I guess.
Right. Mark, your hand is up.
Sorry, I apologize. A phone was ringing. Thank you. Sorry, there's a bunch of us working from home. Oh yeah, my question was, you mentioned earlier sort of the idea of early education, finding out about the opportunities that might be afforded to oneself. And we certainly in the universities, there's ways to address this for individuals who might not be of backgrounds where you were aware of all these things. But I was wondering if you have either projects on the move or thoughts about getting kids from like elementary onwards to know about skills programs, internships that may be available, it's just something I'm passionate about as well, as how do you ensure more people are aware that there's even the possibility of opportunity available?
Yeah. So in terms of that, I'm working with a few other people, or we're going to begin working on it soon. In the meantime, I'm still kind of in the research phase to make sure I try to get as many of these programs on paper as I can. But the idea would be to create workshops and start with different community centers. So that have youth programs, that have after school programs, and speaking directly with the kids and being like, hey, look, these opportunities are available to you. Or, if you can't necessarily do that when you get later on in school, don't forget to get involved, because, really showing them like, okay, here's the path that school, the institution tells you, you go this grade, this grade, this grade, this grade, and eventually you get a job, which we all know is not how it goes. But that's the kind of impression kids are left with, right? Unless they're shown otherwise. So I want to try to tell them, here's a path you can take. Here's a path I took. By the time I got to university, I realized how important it is to get involved in your school, in extracurricular activities, in these things. And so that's the kind of message I want to give. But the method is really going to be try to systematically approach groups that work with youth and give them the tools directly, just through community groups. I was speaking, I had another talk yesterday with the Black Resource Center, Black Research and Black Resource Center. And so they have these workshops, and they're going to bring me on board as well to kind of give that aspect, the more civic side, the more, again, it's about taking the knowledge and just proactively sharing it. So Mark, if you want to help out with that, I'm sure Ellie could give you my email, and we can definitely do that, because I want, the more people we have working on a project like this, the more people that are going around and spreading that information, the better it is. You got to have cast a wide net and just go.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Like, just in the small bits I've seen it, because that narrative starts very early, where if you don't know that your friends are applying for school or CEGEP or a university, if it's just not something talked about around you. Anyways, not to take too much time, but yeah,
No,
for sure.
But just to speak to that too, I mean, it's important for young people, and young people of color in particular, now I'm speaking, to see that to have those role models, to see that other people from their community are also going through these paths, so that they can then imagine themselves doing that as well. And that's something that came out in our discussion yesterday, actually. It's like that Dr. Clarence Bain was talking about, is that you have to really you have to take your place, but you also have to see yourself in the institutions that you want to go to, right? If we didn't have women in leadership positions, then young girls would not have those people to look up to. And the same thing goes for minority communities. You need to see the people that represent you in the positions of leadership to then imagine yourself as a leader, as in those positions, right? I mean, you saw it with Barack Obama. He inspired probably a whole generation. And so, yeah, I want to just continue down that path of showing, hey, you can do this. You may not have thought about it. It may not have been in your wheelhouse before, but you can if this is something you want to do, kind of thing. And here's how.
Kamala Harris is another recent example. How many little girls all of a sudden realized, like, I can do this. I could be president. So I want to sort of broaden that question a bit to students. We have a lot of international students at Concordia. So they're not the little kids in elementary school. They come when they're often in their 20s, and who sort of feel new. And often for me, it's also a question of belonging. It's having the role models, but also knowing I belong and my gifts are welcome. And so when you come as an international student from India, China, or Iran, or Nigeria, it can be intimidating to even try. And so what words of wisdom would you give to students?
Yeah, I guess that's a good question. A lot of it would depend on what their future plans are. If they wanted to stay, right? Because we know that international students sometimes come for permanently, but others, come for the education and leave, which is fine. But if they're looking to stay, I'd say that they should use their time at Concordia to explore the extracurriculars. And I know that that's not necessarily the most obvious thing, right? Because coming from a different country, you have to maintain a certain GPA in order to maintain your visa and all these things. But I think that, once you're in a university, right, or you're in higher education, you have the potential networks that exist there. It's very important to really be involved in those networks, to get involved in an area that interests you. I'm not saying people from abroad must then, create clubs that are specifically for that, special interests or whatever. I think it's important to, in order to gain the skills you need, right, when you graduate, in order to get a job, nobody tells you this, but you do that through school. You do that through the extracurriculars. You do that through or not necessarily extracurriculars that are like encadré or I'll just say with encadré, that are managed by the institution themselves, but create opportunities for yourself. Start working on projects. Come to me, I'll tell you how to make a nonprofit. Just make a nonprofit. Like there's many ways, but I think during school is a time to explore them, to give yourself the tools and or the networks in order to succeed later on. Because that's what, if we're speaking to racialized communities, we need those networks in order to permeate the system and to maintain it and to make sure there's a constant flow. And in our institutions, we need them to take a more proactive role in ensuring that there's a permanent diversity, right? Concordia can hire a bunch of people of color to be teachers, but if they're part-time teachers, that doesn't help. You need to hire full-time teachers. You need to bring on members of the board of directors or the board of governors to weigh in and make sure that Concordia is heading in the right direction. So I guess my advice to them was just like find a thing that won't, tank your studies, but that will help you broaden your network.
Cool. Looking out for other hands. I guess another question I have, Chad, then is sort of, you already started answering it, but sort of the flip side. So I believe we need both. The people need to take the initiative, but the institutions need to provide the opportunities. And so if the MFSC and some of the other organizations at Concordia departments, so how can we be either more welcoming or promote more diversity, promote it better I have control over the MFSC and my colleagues. So what would you say to us?
Well, I think the MFSC has always been a kind of beacon for diversity at Concordia.
And I'm not fishing for compliments, by the way.
No, and I'm
so okay.
I understand that. But in all honesty, while I was there, I think whenever we had questions about diversity, whenever we had questions about creating safe spaces, we referred to the multi-faith chaplaincy to see, okay, well, you were always at the forefront of, in my mind anyways, of diversity policy within Concordia. I think the institution itself, like I said, needs to take a proactive role and not just have committees reviewing and giving recommendations or whatever, but actually take a role in, number one, hiring more full-time staff or more full-time professors, making sure that a good chunk of those full-time professors are also from minority communities or minority groups, whatever, people of color, LGBTQ, indigenous, like what have you, just making sure that that representation is there and somewhat permanent, as well as making it a point to have some form of parity. And I don't know, it's been a while since I looked at the board of governors, but a bit more parity and diversity at that level. And I think only then will they really be able to say that they're taking strides in inclusion and diversity in a concrete way. Because I see, you see more and more large companies creating diversity and inclusion positions. Like they're just popping up everywhere. I'm seeing on LinkedIn, new position, and it's just like, to me, they're obviously going to choose a person of color to represent that position, but it raises the question to me of like, well, is that the only person of color they're going to hire and say, look, we have a diversity person, they're a person of color, thus they must be an expert. And I don't doubt the expertise of these people, but I maybe doubt the sincerity if it's not matched with concrete programs or concrete ways to make that representation permanent and not just a flavor of the month, if you will. Large institutions, whether they be governments or schools or companies, are good at changing with the times. And so the change needs to happen at the top in these institutions, because change from the bottom is much more difficult, especially if we're talking about, universities or multinational corporations or something like that,
don't we need both? I mean, if I think of Concordia, we need clearly the administration, the president and VPs, and I think there have been some good strides. I'm curious to see where that goes with the equity office and the just appointed. She has Nick did a fabulous workshop on anti-racism with a lot of folks. So I hope we're going in the right direction, but we also need it's hard to talk about a hierarchy, but sort of different forces. We need the students who always, have their own. You have your own. The CSU and the GSA, they still have their own networks and push us in different ways, in new ways. And also I think the numbers of staff we're a force as well, even though we don't necessarily have the structural power. But if we talk about movement and communities that bring about change, I think in my perfect world, we all work together, hierarchy or not. And I guess maybe that's my final question, because we're getting close to the end, but the role of community and all that, you mentioned earlier about working with different communities, but and building alliances. I'm just wondering if you have some insights into that.
Yeah, I think it's crucial to build alliances. I know that, I guess what I missed before in my what have I done since I graduated, I also ran for office at the provincial level for the Green Party of Quebec. And so in that capacity, I really made it a point to approach different community groups and to understand their realities and to understand their needs, because at the end of the day, they are the front lines of our society in dealing with communities that need our help, that are vulnerable communities, that are communities in need. They know, they're on the ground, living with these communities, working with them directly, right? I think they have a lot to say in terms of adopting best practices, changes that need to be made in order to make more inclusive and safe spaces. And to bring it back to Concordia, I recognize that they're making efforts. I recognize that the efforts have been underway for I think 2 or 3 years now as well. But these are the same kinds of questions that were being asked while I was at Concordia almost 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And so now we're finally seeing change. So institutions, governments can easily be pressured by the outside. Schools less easily, because at the end of the day, their market is more or less unlimited. There will always be someone who's willing to look the other way in order to get their degree so that they can get their job, because that's what school tells us. You do this grade, this grade, this grade, this grade, and then you get a job, right? So I think, and in essence, it's private institutions. So private institutions are much harder to sway from the outside, although it is possible. But again, it's a question of finding those pressure points. Where they can be influenced, I think, is in partnerships with community organizations, with different outside groups, because in that sense, they're not being quote unquote pressured to take a stance, but they are bringing in outside expertise in order to help them formulate a policy. And so I think there is room for that to create change. But again, I think that kind of change that will happen within the institution as a whole will take time, because we're dealing with other humans, right? We're dealing with other humans in positions of authority and in positions of power, and the structures that exist to keep them in power, right? To keep a certain demographic there, because as you mentioned before, when they were thought up and made, they were made by one section of the community, right? So it's difficult to then turn to the people in power and say, hey, how about you be proactive in, divesting some of that power and giving it to other groups? And, the people who are willing to do that are few and far between.
Yeah.
So, I think strides have been made. I think we're in a period where there's a thirst for change and a thirst for self-examination, but self-examination takes time and is painful. So, at every step we're going to take, we'll have pushback and some kind of backlash. And it's how we manage that backlash and move forward with it that, will tell us what our next step is, I guess.
Yeah, you're right. It always sounds great. I'm willing to give up power until it gets concrete. In theory, that sounds like a great idea. But if you actually ask me to say, well, then, what does that mean to not necessarily have a seat at this table? I go like, oh, wait a minute.
Well, exactly. A good example, I guess, is communism, right? You looked at everyone was gung-ho communist until the government's like, well, we'll give up power when you're subdued enough, I guess.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
these ideas are good in theory, but you need to put them in practice.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, we're nearing the end of our time. So I just want to give people a last chance to say anything or comments. I always like to, I mean, to me, this has been really enlightening and very hopeful. I guess maybe that's the very last, I already said the last question, but the very last question I want to ask, and maybe ask all of us, what gives you hope, Chad? Like, it's work, and it's, you know, we've done it. We've been involved in this work for decades, probably, you know, longer, and we will, you know, it's not something we solve overnight, but where does your hope lie?
My hope lies these days in the realization that there is a desire to have this discussion, to have this debate. And I know that at times the debate gets ugly, right? And it gets personal and it gets vitriolic, but it's important that we're having it. It's, you know, there was a time where we couldn't talk about these things, where it would just be brushed over, you know, completely under the rug. But I think now there is a greater willingness, at least, to engage in these conversations. You know, in terms of having allies, you know, our allies are getting better versed in communicating these things. And, you know, like we said, in order for anything to change, the dominant group needs to recognize the problem and start working towards it. And I think we have a space now to engage in that dialogue and engage in that debate. And you know, as long as we're speaking to our audience in a way that is receptive, even if it's not always receptive, as long as we can take it back and be like, actually, here's what we're trying to do, I think there's a way forward, you know. And if we're ignored, then we'll take back to the streets and we'll get that year back, because it's a battle that can never be put to the side. Everyone has rights, and we should all have equal rights.
Right. Wow. Wow. It's a strong word. Really, really encouraging and thought-provoking. We come from different perspectives, but I certainly learned a lot, and I hope you did too. And Johanna says, thank you for the opportunity to listen today.
Thanks for being here.
Someone else said it's about dialogue, not debate. An earlier comment was about the keyword is getting involved, and Stefan says a corporate version of I can't be bad, I have a blank friend. So the tokenism we talked about. So there's some more comments. Some of the others were from Shaheen. So so like always, we could, you know, we sort of raise some topics, we could talk about them forever, but I think the keyword is to get involved. And you offered earlier, if anyone wants to get in touch with you, I can pass on your contact if you don't already have it. That's really generous, Chad. But it does really give me hope that I think there is a path forward. And I mean, but it's also easy for me to say, as a white person with a lot of privilege, a good job, even in COVID, I'm very aware that I have still a nice job at Concordia. I don't have to worry about my paycheck or about my food security. And so so it's always thought-provoking and sort of challenges me to ask myself some difficult questions and then act on them, not just to say that sounds great, but actually say what privileges do I have that I can either use to benefit others or that I can need to give up.
Well, that's the first step. If more people ask themselves those questions, then we can move faster, I think.
Well, that's what we're here for at the MFSC. So I want to thank you all for a wonderful conversation and for today's cafe.